There is a corpse in my bed. I used to be a total horror junkie. My main favorites were all the slasher movies from the 80s. I had posters of all the big characters: Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, and etc. If you name the character, I probably had some representation of them as a poster or figurine. I even got into the newer names of horror, like the Five Nights at Freddy's games, even if they are old now. Then I had an experience as a teenager that made me rethink what horror is to me. Nowadays, I find nothing scarier than real life, or what people can do to each other. I never knew feelings of fear or dread until I found a corpse in my bed and learned what happened to her. During my junior year in high school, my parents moved us to a small town in northern Ohio. My parents, who worked at the same company, had gotten a transfer, leading to a raise and slightly better house. We moved into a two-story white house that sat on a back road. The nearest neighbors were about a mile away. I consider it to be in the literal middle of nowhere. My parents had gotten a good deal on the house. There was nothing wrong with the house itself. The plumbing was working. There was no stain anyway. The house was in rather good shape. The only thing was that the last owner had left a few of their possessions behind. A few clothes and appliances were still there when we arrived. The real estate agent said that the last owner had left in a hurry. A few house payments were missed before anyone knew what happened. It seemed weird to my parents, but not a deal breaker. We moved in immediately. Everything that the last owner left behind was stored and sold off. I started to like the house and property after a while. I had my first backyard, and it was big. At the end of our property was our neighbor farming fields, but their house was still way out there. I started doing okay at the new school and made some new friends after the first couple of days. Then, one night, it had happened. Something that robbed me of my ability to sleep in that house ever again. My parents had a client party one night, so I was left alone with our dog, Benji. We were watching my top slasher films, Nightmare on Elm Street, the original one. I thought Robert Englund had done an amazing job of it. It was near the middle of the movie when I heard the call of nature. I paused the movie so I wouldn't miss anything, of which I had already seen hundreds of times. Benji was sleeping on the sofa when I had left. The bathroom was downstairs, and just outside of it was a window that was overlooking the backyard. I finished my businesses and walked out to hear Benji downstairs, barking loudly at something. It sounded like he was in the kitchen below me. I was going back downstairs when I checked out the window, when I saw something strange. The backlight wasn't on, so I admit I couldn't see anything under the dim moonlight. But I swear that I could make out the shape of a person in my backyard. Their back to me. I walked down backstairs and through the kitchen, where I could reach the door to the backyard. Benji was at the door, still barking. I switched the backlight on and saw nothing out there. I stepped further to get a better view, but there was still nothing there. I guess it was my imagination, I decided. Plus Benji does tend to bark at nothing sometimes. When we went back to watching the movie, while I was feeling slightly unnerved, as the movie ended, I deduced I had spooked myself. The constant movie consumption and the late night pasta reading had finally gotten to me. I was feeling tired and went up to my room, which was also upstairs. Benji went with me. I needed him with me because something was not right. I felt like someone was in the house with me, even though I'm supposed to be alone. We reached the top of the stairs, and I noticed the air around me felt colder, like cold as ice. This was September, going into October in Ohio. It doesn't get this cold for no reason. I could even see my breath as I walked upstairs. I walked to my closed bedroom door and felt the temperature in the well-isolated house drop further. I turned the doorknob, the cold metal burning my skin as I gripped it. I turned the cold metal and opened the door, the wood creaking loudly throughout the house. My darkened room was heavy with the air of dread and death. Though the room was dark, I could still make out shapes of my bed, my desk, and other possessions. I wondered what was causing my anxiety until I looked closer at my bed. The covers were pulled over neatly, and under them I could make out a human-looking shape beneath the covers. I had rubbed my ways, believing that this was an illusion. Then I looked back and realized this was no trick of my eyes. There was the shape of a body beneath my covers, as if in a morgue. Judging from how much space it was taking up in my bed, the shape was roughly my size. I had remained frozen in my spot as I watched the human shape occupying my bed, stagnant beneath the covers. I couldn't tell because it was so dark, but I could have sworn I've seen the slight rising and falling of breathing coming from there. The shape started rising slowly until sitting upright. The blanket slipped off, revealing the scarred dead face of a pale girl. She had some small cuts and bruises covering her face. She wore a dirty t-shirt. Her arms, looking skinned and flesh, was exposed. She went from sitting upright to standing on my mattresses. Benji was not growling at the ghost intruder, but instead whimpered, and he backed away. Her clothes had been covered in dirt and dried blood and torn all over. After standing straight up and towering over me, she raised her arm slowly and pointed toward the window. She opened her mouth to an impossibly wide gape and let out a blood-curdling scream that caused reverberations throughout the house. This was a kind of scream filled with suffering and torment as her dead eyes buried into me. I ran out of the room and downstairs to run away from the sight of a dead girl and the horrid scream that filled the whole empty house. Benji ran with me as we bolted out of the house. We made it to the road when my parents had finally come home. Sensing my distress, I told them what I had seen, and they went upstairs to investigate. Of course, there was nothing there. They told I probably had a nightmare, even though I was not asleep then. They advised that I should cut back the late-night movies. I didn't sleep in my room that night, instead choosing the sofa downstairs. I started thinking maybe I psyched myself into a really vivid nightmare and started to forget about the dead girl I saw. This is until a few days later. My dad was starting to make a garden in our backyard during an afternoon, and I had been helping him that day. While digging, we heard Benji barking at the center of the yard. He had been digging over there himself, and he must have found something. Dad and I had gone over to see what was wrong, and he had retched when we saw the decomposing remains of a human hand. He had called 911, and a team was sent over to dig up the yard. It wasn't just a hand that was buried, but a whole person. Even more disturbing was that this gruesome discovery was that it was the girl who I had seen in my room a few nights ago. She was heavily decomposing, maggots all over her body, and feasting on her remains. It took a while before we learned anything about who she was and what happened to her. And when we did, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. The girl had been identified as Catherine Winters, a local high school student who had been missing for almost a whole year. She had been last seen leaving the school after club activities and had walked home. She hadn't been seen since then. Months had gone by without any leads, and the police had all but exhausted their resources. As for the state she had been found in, the mortician found several disturbing details surrounding the young girl's beaten and bloodied body. There had been red marks and indentations around her wrists, indicating that she had been bound in handcuffs or shackles. The same marks could be found around her ankles. There were also deep bruises on her legs, where it was determined someone had shattered her leg bones. Someone didn't want her to run away while they continued the torture. Judging from the body shape, she must have been held captive for months, receiving food and water very rarely, if at all. She had been starved and dehydrated for a long amount of time. When she hadn't been neglected, she had been tortured. There were burn marks around her body, where perhaps a lighter or a lit cigar or cigarette had contacted her skin. She also had cuts and more bruises around her body. In some areas, she had patched off skin missing from her body. One of her eyes had also suffered damage. The thought of her torture was downright chilling and nauseating. There was, however, one more detail that whenever I think about it, a chill runs down my spine. There were dry DNA samples found between her thighs, suggesting that she had been sexually assaulted by her captor. Most likely, this had gone for some time. Even more disturbing was that there were traces of relatively fresh samples found, which points to her being sexually assaulted post-mortem. The captor may have kept her body from decomposing faster, so he could continue to violate her lifeless body. The last act of dominance of a sick man over a dead girl. The killer and captor had buried Catherine in the backyard before leaving, possibly being seen by someone, or had gone to a new town in search of a new victim. Catherine had been cremated after the autopsy, and her remains were returned to her family. It seemed at last they had found some closure, but not justice. Meanwhile, the previous owner was being tracked down by the authorities. I had never told anyone about seeing her a few nights before. That had been my secret until now. I never slept very well in that house until after moving out, and even then, I think about it on most nights. I replay my ghostly encounter in my mind and think about her pointing to the window, to the backyard, and the pain-filled banshee-like scream. I started thinking about what happened and why. Was Catherine Winters trying to tell me where her body was? Was she trying to tell me what she had gone through? Was she trying to get closure for her grieving family? Real life can be more horrifying than any work of fiction. I had realized that on the night I found the corpse in my bed.